form of Yahweh. So if you stuck a U on the end, there is an Old Testament character that has that name. If you remember when Ahab and Jezebel were trying to kill all the prophets of God, there was a servant of Ahab who hid 100 prophets. And his name is Obadiah in English, but it's really Obadyahu. He has a U on the end of his, but you don't see that in English. So it's several characters in the Old Testament have this name. Okay, we did that. Okay, so Obadiah, this particular prophet, he's unknown in the Bible outside of his own book, so he's not anywhere else referenced, anywhere in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And he doesn't provide any information about himself. He's like Joel in that respect. He doesn't mention who his parents are. He doesn't mention what his occupation is or his social status. He doesn't mention what city he's from, what tribe he's from, whether he's from Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom. So you really don't know anything about him, and he's just, in that way, he's very similar to Joel. Okay, the date, like Joel, you can't really we couldn't pinpoint a specific date for Joel, and you can't for this book either. The book doesn't really give precise historical data to be able to establish a certain date. So scholars have pinned dates anywhere from 889 to 313 BC, which you can see is a wide gap of over 500 years. The thing that helps with the date a little bit is it talks about Jerusalem being attacked, or it's alluded to. And Jerusalem was suffered at the hands of enemies 7 times during the Old Testament. And we know when those 7 events occurred, but Obadiah is either predicting one of these 7 events or he's recalling it. So he's either predicting that it's going to happen or it's already happened and he's reflecting back on it. It depends on how you want to interpret some of the passages. The most popular opinion, though, at least in modern scholarship, this changes from time to time, but right now the most popular opinion is he's recounting the last of the 7 attacks on Jerusalem, which would be the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BC. And the reason most scholars kind of side with that one is because the Edomites are reported to have participated in this attack. It's mentioned in Psalms 137:7 and an outside of the Bible book called 1 Ezra 4:45. So, and the reason for that is, we'll get into the book, you'll see Edom is who the book is about. So the prophecies are all against the country of Edom. And so because Edom helped participate in this attack on Jerusalem, then most scholars think that this is probably the time frame in which it was written. So if that is true, and you take the opinion that Obadiah is reflecting back on the events instead of predicting them happening in the future, then Obadiah would have been written after Jerusalem fell in 586, so sometime while they were in Babylonian captivity. Okay, as far as the canon, in English Bibles, Obadiah is the 4th of the minor prophets, so it sits between Amos and Jonah. The prophets related to the Assyrian period are placed first in the minor prophets. So if you go through the minor prophets, Hosea, Amos, Jonah, Micah are at the beginning of that collection, and that's because they all happened during the Assyrian time frame when Assyria was the major world power. So why would Obadiah be stuck in with that group if you don't actually know when it happened? Well, did people think that it occurred during the Assyrian period when they were putting this collection together, which this was assembled by the Jewish community, the list of which ones come first. So maybe it's because they knew something about when it was written that we don't know. But it may be because the other book with an oracle against Edom is Amos. So Amos talks against Edom. So perhaps they placed Obadiah after Amos because those are the 2 books that talk about Edom. So maybe its place in your Bible isn't actually because of the time it was written, but because of the topic that it's written about. And that might be why it sits between Amos and Jonah. Okay, it was accepted in the Jewish canon before Christ. It's mentioned as one of the 12 minor prophets in a writing called Sirach, which is a Jewish writing before Jesus came. It is the shortest book in the Old Testament. It only has 21 verses. It's never quoted or even alluded to specifically in the New Testament. It is actually rarely referred to in early Christian writings. But Jerome is the dude who wrote or translated the Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the Old Testament, which is still used by the Catholic Church community today. He translated that in the late 300s, but he wrote a commentary on Obadiah in 396. So you can tell from history this book is not one that's referred to a lot. The New Testament writers didn't talk about it. The early Christian writers didn't talk about it. So it's a little bit more of an obscure book from that standpoint, and partly because it's short, partly because of what it's about. Okay, the text, the current Hebrew version of the text is sound. There's very little to question about it. So the text from which we translated into English is in good shape. The oldest text that we do have to refer to is a 2nd century AD Hebrew text. That's not anything you need to worry about. Okay, as far as literary relations, Obadiah does share some similar language with some other Old Testament books. So like if you look in Numbers, there's a speech from Balaam where Balaam is talking about Edom. And so there's some similar phraseology in Balaam's speech that you can also see in Obadiah. Amos talks against Edom in his book, and so there's some similar terminology in Amos with Obadiah. Similar with Joel. Joel briefly mentions Edom in his book. The biggest correlation, though, is in Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 7 through 22 are pretty similar to parts of Obadiah. So that's the one that's the closest. So as you look at these different texts, it's hard to kind of gauge, did Obadiah write after them and therefore was reading their text and kind of borrowed some of the information? Was Obadiah an earlier one and these writers referred to Obadiah? Or did they not refer to each other at all? Maybe they looked at a different text that doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe none of the above. Maybe the Holy Spirit just inspired them to write similar things, but they didn't actually reference any other material. So it's hard to tell, but there are some similarities with these 4 books in particular. Okay, so the book is about Edom. So let's talk about Edom. What is the country of Edom? Why should we care about Edom? So Edom, the Bible actually gives more information about the kingdom of Edom than any other kingdom that surrounded Israel. Now, not to say about some of the other world powers like Egypt or something, but the countries that immediately bordered Israel, the Bible talks more about Edom than the other ones. So the central area of Edom is called Mount Seir. So that's a term, when you hear Mount Seir, it usually references Edom. So sometimes instead of calling the country Edom, it'll just call it Mount Seir. So you just have to know that they're the same thing, same place. So the central area of Edom is called Mount Seir, and the eastern part or border is this wadi that you don't really need to know about, and the south border is the Dead Sea. Its southern border is a river, and then you have a gulf also that's mentioned in the Old Testament. The eastern limit is the desert. I'll show you a map in a minute. This will make more sense. So when you go east, the border is going to be the desert. There's nothing out there. The western border is going to be that wadi. All right, so the kingdom of Edom was previously occupied by the Horites and the Hivites. So as you read through Genesis, you'll come across these names of these different peoples called the Horites and the Hivites, and they lived there previously until the Edomites come in and dispossess them and drive them out. The kingdom itself, the country of Edom, it's on a plateau which is divided into 3 terraces, and the total in total, it rises above the wadi, so it goes up to about 6,200 feet. So it sits high above the sea level. It has a lot of large cliffs and gorges. The plateau enclosed an area that's about 70 by 15 miles, but the village area is only about 9 miles across. So the inhabitable part of this country is not a real large territory. So it's a fairly small country in general, especially when you think about our states in our country. It's not even as big as most of our states, but the part that was actually inhabitable is even a lot smaller than that. So the Bible mentions 4 major cities of the plateau. Basra, which is not to be confused with the city in Iraq by the same name but different spelling, not the same place. Timan, which is the only city actually mentioned in the book of Obadiah. Sela and Dedan, which Dedan is located in Arabia. It's in the southern part. I don't remember if it's on the map I have or not. Sometimes Edom controlled it, sometimes Edom didn't control it. So those are your 4 major cities. All right, so wow, you can't see anything. Okay, Edom is that bottom country there. I thought it would show up better than that. I'm colorblind. I can't even tell you what color that is. Is it yellow? Okay, the thing at the bottom that looks yellow. That's Edom. You can see it borders Israel. So Judah is going to be that country on the northwest corner of it that it borders. And if you look to the right or the east, you'll see that that's basically desert out there. But there are some tribes out there called the Nabattu tribes, which are Arabs. And then you got Arabs to the west. And then immediately northeast of Edom should be Moab. So the 2 northern countries that border it are going to be Moab on the east and Judah on the west there. So the important thing to realize is that Judah does border Edom, and so the fact that they're bordering countries means they're going to have conflicts. The country that's labeled in the top northeast there, that's Basra. Not that it really matters for what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, this is just a modern-day map with Edom drawn over it, so you can see that it borders. Obviously, it borders the sea there, so it's going to have coastal territory with it, so it's going to have seaports. Even though most of the country is uninhabitable, it does have seaports there on that part that borders the water there. You can see it's very close to Egypt, and then it borders Israel north of that. So the cities you can see there, Basra in the top, and then Timan is somewhere kind of in the northern part too. Dedan is in the bottom, the south there, and that's the one that they sometimes controlled, sometimes they didn't control it. So and I'll come back to this later, I'll come back to this later, but if you see to their immediate east, which is a desert, you see that term Nabattu tribes. That's going to be the people who eventually overtake them and destroy them. So just kind of remember that in your mind, that they're an Arab group that's to their east. Okay. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is the area where Basra supposedly was. You can see that it looks pretty uninhabitable. It's a lot of some plateaus with a lot of cliffs, not a lot of vegetation, so there's not a lot of places to grow crops, to shepherd sheep, that kind of thing. So we'll talk about in a second what they did for money, but you can see that it's not a very inhabitable place. And I'm not going to specifically, I don't have pictures of this, and I'm not going to really talk about it, but some scholars think that, and you'll see this if you go searching on the internet, that city, Salah, is what we call Petra today. If you've heard of Petra, if you saw Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the city where they go at the end of the movie to find the Holy Grail, that's Petra, that's modern-day Petra, which is located in Jordan, the country of Jordan today. Some people say Salah is that area, even though what you see when you go there today, the city of Petra there in the rocks, that's from a Roman time period, so that wouldn't be something Edom built, but some people say that's where Salah was, and those buildings that exist there now were built later on. But it's suspect whether or not that's really where Salah even was. So, but anyway, it gives you an idea, though, of sort of the terrain and what the area looks like, if you can think about Petra. Okay, Edom, the land of Edom it's very dry. The limited rain allowed only for villages along a route called the King's Highway, where there were springs. So basically all the people lived along this road, which is a trade route, okay? And so the cities basically line up along this highway. Y'all good? All right. I lost my train of thought. Okay, so there's springs along the highway, and so that's where most of the cities are. All right, so since there was little land to cultivate, the people were not farmers or herdsmen. Instead, they thrived on trade. So they actually were a relatively wealthy nation. So if you think about it, they do have ports down on that seacoast area. And so it's a way to get trade up through the Middle Eastern area there. And so that's really what they made their livelihood off of, is trade routes. But their main issue, and the main issue that God's going to chastise them for, or one of the main issues, is that they took a lot of pride in the fact of where they lived. They felt like they were invincible because they didn't feel like anybody could reach them to attack them there. So when you live in a very unhospitable area that it's very hard to get an army into, you feel like you're not going to ever be attacked. And so they felt like nobody could do anything to them. And so from that standpoint, they became very prideful of who they were and their situation, and they felt very secure in it. And that's going to be their ultimate downfall. Okay, their religion, there's very little written material discovered from Edom, so it's hard to know a whole lot. There has been discovered that they had a god named, I don't even know how you pronounce it, Kos maybe, I don't know, who's some type of hunting god / storm god, but there's really not much known about that character. There has been some pottery found which depicts a pregnant mother goddess. Don't even know the name of this goddess. So they may have had a god and then a consort female goddess that went with that god. Not really sure, but Habakkuk 3:3 says that God came from Teman. Teman is that city, one of those 4 cities that the Bible mentions in Edom. And then there's an ostrakon. An ostrakon is a piece of pottery. It's broken pottery that people would write on. Think of it as the ancient sticky notes, okay? You break a piece of pottery, you can't use it for anything else, so, hey, we'll write on it. So usually they would write, insignificant things. You wouldn't want to write anything significant on it, but you could write, daily stuff you might need or whatever, shopping list at the store, that kind of thing. So there's an ostrakon found at that place, and it mentions Yahweh of Teman. So maybe they had some kind of mixed religion where they did still worship Yahweh in some way, but they blended it with some other deities. But it's really hard to know for sure what their exact religion is. Okay, according to the law, Edomites could enter the congregation of Israel in the 3rd generation. So remember, their ancestor is Esau. Okay, so they are descendants of Isaac and Abraham through the lineage of Esau. So they are related to the Israelites. And for that reason, they could join in the congregation of Israel if they wanted to. And because of that, the Israelites were not supposed to harbor any kind of ill will towards them, which we'll see in a second. But that didn't always work out too well. All right, so Edom and Israel, their relationship with each other. So Esau married several women, to be kind. So he married women from the Canaanite Hittite area, Ishmaelites, and Hivites. Now remember, the Hivites are the ones who lived in the land of Edom before the Edomites came in. So he married at least one woman that was a Hivite. He first lived in Canaan, but he eventually decided to move to Seir, which is Edom, once he kind of outgrew the area. His descendants displaced the Horites, and Esau is identified with Edom, so they're synonymous. So sometimes even in the book of Obadiah, he'll talk about Esau, but Esau stands for the country of Edom. And Edom established a monarchy before Israel did. Okay, near the end of Israel's desert wandering, so when they're trying to go from Egypt into the Promised Land, when they're about to go into the Promised Land, the Israelites asked if they could go through Edom as a route to get up into the Promised Land, and they were denied. So that's the first sort of animosity between the two countries, is when Edom did not allow Israel to pass through. So that did not sit well with Israel. Despite this, Israel was forbidden to hate Edom because, as Deuteronomy 23:7 says, he is your brother. But these are the only kind words ever spoken about Edom in the whole Old Testament. So they're not two countries that got along, okay? So even though they border each other, even though they're related to each other, for the most part of their history, they hated each other, okay? All right, Saul successfully fought against Edom, so this is one of the first times you see Israel and Edom fighting. So after Saul, David then kind of took that a step further, and he conquers Edom and expands the kingdom of Israel, so it becomes part of the Israel territory. Edom was made into a province and controlled by the Israelite garrison, so Israelites sent troops down there to control the territory. Once this happened, the prince of Edom, named Hadad, he left and he fled to Egypt. And he didn't come back to Edom until both David and Joab had died. But even after David died, Solomon still controlled it. He built a fleet of ships on one of the coastal cities of Edom. And from there, he had sea access that he could ship and trade around the Middle East, and even it's speculated that he sent ships to India and different places like that. Okay, so after Solomon dies, Edom had about 50 years of independence until Jehoshaphat gained control of Ezion-Geber again, so that coastal city. So he gets control of it again. But instead of really taking over the whole country, he just places a deputy in Edom to kind of watch over it. And then later in Jehoshaphat's reign, instead of a deputy, they just allow Edom to have their own king. And Edom actually joins with Judah to attack Moab. So this is one time where they actually band together for a common goal, and they attack Moab together. As you keep going down through history, Amaziah fought against Selah, which is one of those four cities, and Uzziah built a city called Elath. But during the reign of Ahaz, Judah was attacked by Syria and Israel. And so while Judah has their focus north instead of south, they're focused on Syria and Israel, attacking them from the north. They kind of quit paying attention to Edom in the south, and Edom kind of regains their independence, and Judah never takes it back over again. So during that time, they recapture Elath, and they get control of their country again. And they even go into Judah and take some prisoners from Judah. So that's kind of the short history of some of their interactions. So Edom eventually, though, even though they gain their independence back from Judah, they do eventually become a vassal state of Assyria. Like pretty much the entire Middle East, they became a vassal of Assyria. And they're mentioned in a lot of different Assyrian writings over a 250-year period where the different kings of Assyria talk about Edom and these other countries around Israel. Okay, So what's the situation that this book is talking about? It's probably one of these two, probably this, not the one on the slide yet. All right, so some believe the Edomites aided Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in his campaign against King Jehoiakim of Judah in 597. The way you get to that, though, is you have to change the Hebrew text in 2 Kings 24:2 to say Edom instead of Aram. So Aram is another term for Syria. So if you think the text really says Edom instead of Aram, then you can make this conclusion. But if you think it says Aram, then this doesn't really hold up. And if you change it in 2 Kings 24:2, you also have to change it in Ezekiel 27:16. But some of our English translations have made this assumption. I think the RSV is one of them. So if you check your translation, you may have differences depending on which one you read as to whether it says Aram or Edom in those two spots in the Old Testament. So maybe the Edomites helped in that situation. It's a little iffy, though. Okay, the next one is true. Edom did send messengers to a meeting that King Zedekiah had in Judah in 594 or 593 BC because they were discussing whether or not they wanted to rebel against Babylon. So Zedekiah was a puppet king that the Babylonians put on the throne, and he did what he was told for a while, but then he started getting pressure from his people, so he started thinking about whether or not he should rebel, and he was trying to talk some of these other nations around them into collectively rebelling. And so Edom sent some ambassadors basically to this meeting to discuss whether or not they should or should not rebel. But Jeremiah is there as well, and he tells them, you're crazy, you don't need to do this. And so that's recorded in Jeremiah 27:1-11. And ultimately, Zedekiah makes some bad decisions and gets put down by the Babylonians for it. Okay, all right, so Jerusalem is destroyed. So that was in 593 or 94. Fast forward 6 or 7 years, and Jerusalem is destroyed by Babylon in 586. So during the destruction, some of the Jews did flee out of Judah, and they went towards Edom to try to escape. And some got into Edom successfully, whereas others, the Edomites, blocked them from getting into the country and basically abandoned them to be taken prisoner by the Assyrians, which is another reason they don't like them, because they wouldn't let them into the country. Okay, but the ones who did get into Edom, they did eventually go back into Judah once they realized that the Babylonians put a puppet governor in place in Judah, a guy named Gedaliah. And once they realized that, Gedaliah's in charge, he's kind of a puppet governor, if they haven't taken us into exile so far, they're not going to, then those Jews went back into Judah to live. Now, what I didn't mention here is Gedaliah didn't survive very long. He got assassinated, so that kind of messed up those plans. Anyway, but the real issue and what the book may be alluding to is when the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem in 586, Edom participated in the destruction and the looting of the city. This made the Jews extremely mad because they basically were mocking the Jews for being destroyed. And they went in and they helped with some of the destruction, some of the burning of the city, and they took some of the treasures out of the city for themselves. I think I mentioned the third one already. So the Edomites took control of so after this happened, you have a vacuum of power now. Judah is no longer in control of their territory. They have a puppet governor, but they've lost control of the entire southern part of the country of Judah. So everything they only controlled a little bit south of of Jerusalem. But the southern part of Judah, they didn't control anymore. And so the Edomites came in and took that part of the country over and claimed it as their own. And so even when the Jews came back from captivity back into Judah, they controlled Jerusalem and a little bit south of Jerusalem, but this area that the Edomites took over, the Jews never got that back. Not at this time. And so that area became controlled by the Edomites, but this area is later going to not be called Edom anymore. It's going to be called Idumea during the Greek period, which you read about in the New Testament. You'll read about Idumea in the Gospels. And what famous character is an Idumean in the Gospels? Yeah, Herod the Great. Not a popular Jewish character because he's not Jewish. Okay, they hate him. He's an Idumean, which is the descendants of the Edomites. And he married what is probably a Nabatean princess, one of his wives. He had multiple wives, which is that Arab group to the east of Edom. For political reasons, he would have married them. So you've got a guy ruling you who's not Jewish. He's an Idumean, and his wife is not Jewish either, and at least not one of his main wives. So you can see why they hated him and why he only cared about power. He didn't care about the Jewish religion so much. So that gives you a little bit of background on all that. Okay, it's commonly assumed that Edom eventually fell to the adjacent Nabatean Arab tribes, which is what I was talking about just a second ago. By the time Malachi writes, which is around 460 BC, the Edomites have already been pushed out of their land. So these Arab tribes would have came in and taken over what we know as the country of Edom, and the Edomites would have been forced north into what used to be that southern area of Judah, which would now be called Idumea at this point. So they're forced out of their original homeland. All right, so during the Hellenistic period, animosity between the Jews and Edom persisted, and during the Hasmonean period, which is around 166 BC, a guy named Judas Maccabeus defeats the Idumeans. The conquest was completed by a Jewish guy named John Hyrcanus, who forced the Idumeans to be circumcised and to obey the Jewish laws. So the Edomites / Idumeans kind of fall out of significance after this event, which you can see through all that why these groups are not going to like each other. All right, so the message of Obadiah, we're getting close to the end here of the intro. Obadiah is unique in that the entire book is essentially an oracle against a single country, and that country is Edom. He does briefly mention the fate of a couple other nations at the end of the book, but basically the whole book is about Edom and how basically God's going to get them for what they've done. He doesn't mention the sins of his own people. He doesn't mention the great world powers of the Old Testament period, so he doesn't talk about Assyria, Babylon, Persia, whoever would have been the power when he wrote. His book doesn't raise any doctrinal issues, and he doesn't make reference to the law or breaking the law or anything like that. So as far as popularity, you would think Obadiah is probably a pretty popular prophet, right? I mean, he doesn't say anything bad about the Jews, but he points his finger at Edom and says, you guys, you're going to get it. So the Jewish people probably liked his message as opposed to some of the other prophets that probably they didn't care too much for what they had to say. All right, so this is kind of a brief outline of the book. So it's a short book, it's only 21 verses. So you got verse 1's the heading, and then you talk about the destruction of Edom, and then the restoration of Israel at the end. So you can see there's not a whole lot going on here. It's pretty straightforward. Any question on the intro stuff? I know that was the first spell, so we'll go through a couple verses real quick, but anybody have any questions on the intro? I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear you.
3:13. Why does somebody think Obadiah?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I didn't read the specifics of the different interpretations. I don't know the answer to that. The question is in one of the slides, I said the scholars range in possible dates from the books from the late 800s to the early 300s. And he was asking what would be the rationale for an early 300 date for the writing. I don't know the answer to that. Okay, I think this is the last slide, so we'll just get into the text here briefly. Okay, so verse 1, it says the vision of Obadiah. The word vision, it implies that it's a prophecy. So it's kind of ironic. He says it's a vision, but then when you actually read it, he talks about hearing the message from God instead of seeing a vision. So the term vision there is just standing for the fact that he received information from God. And then it gives his name, but then that's it. He doesn't give anything beyond his name. He doesn't say who his parents are, where he's from, anything like that. So that's all you know about this character is his name. All right, so here starts the oracle. He just goes straight into the oracle. So he says, "Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom." So you know right out of the gate, the whole thing's going to be about Edom. "We have heard a report from the Lord." The original King James said, "We have heard a rumor from the Lord," which makes it sound like, man, maybe this is true, maybe it's not true. Like, we don't really know. We just heard this stuff, and maybe it's real. The word doesn't mean rumor. It's a report. You've received information from God, so you know it's accurate. And then it says, "And a messenger has been sent among the nations, saying." So in other words, God has, and we don't know what this means exactly, but in some way, God has sent messengers out to the other countries to let them know that this next statement is going to take place. So he's informed other countries other than Israel of what's about to be said. So it says, arise and let us rise up against her for battle. So in other words, God sent out messengers to other countries saying, all right, it's time for us to prepare for war. You're going to go and fight against Edom and destroy Edom. So the us there, though, when it says let us, the us includes God. Okay, so God is the one speaking. So he's saying, I'm going to rise up against Edom, but in doing so, I'm going to rise up some other countries to have them go fight against Edom. All right, so now he talks to Edom directly, and he says, "Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be greatly despised." So the issue, and we'll see it in the next verse. I guess maybe I should just go ahead and read part of that. All right, so verse 3, "The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high. You say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground?" So the issue that Edom had, that they struggled with, is they were very prideful because of where they lived. They thought no one would ever invade them, no one would ever take them, because nobody would ever want to come through that terrain to try to get to them. They lived in a very elevated area, and to get up to it, you had to go through a lot of gorges and crevices, and imagine trying to go through the Grand Canyon to get to another country. Like, who would want to fool with that, right? So they thought because of that, nobody's ever going to come here to try to take us. And because of that, they became very arrogant, and that was the next bill. So we'll stop there. But so you can kind of see, though, that that's going to be their downfall is their pride. But their pride led them to make other mistakes as well. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? All right. You can think about this week. Do we have a similar faulty mentality in our country? You can answer that for yourself. All right. Thanks, everybody.